Welcome to our talk, DNSpooq Does DNS Cache Poisoning Still Matter at GreHack 2021. Who are we? I'm Moshe Kol, I'm security researcher at JSOC, and together with me working on this research is Shlomi Oberman, a chairman at JSOC. So what are we going to speak about today? We are going to begin with an introduction to the DNS protocol and an overview of cache poisoning attacks, as well as some recent ones. Then we will continue to talk about DNSpooq and the cache poisoning attack we found on DNSmask. Then we will continue and discuss about some of the impacts of cache poisoning attacks, and we will conclude with some mitigations and thoughts. So DNS, the DNS protocol, is a core internet protocol that is used to map between domain names and IP addresses. So computer networks understand IP addresses, but humans are better with domain names. So therefore, a distributed database system has been invented to bridge this gap. It works with the client-server architecture, where the client resolves the name by querying a configured DNS server. So here in this example, the client queries www.example.com. The server looks up the response in its cache and returns a response to the client, specifying the relevant IP address, together with the time to live value, specifying how much time the client should cache this query. If the server does not have an answer right away, it needs to look the answer up. And if it is a recursive DNS server, then it does this process recursively. First, consulting the root name servers, then consulting the COM name server, then the COM name server directs the DNS server to the example.com authoritative name server, and the authoritative name server will return the response that will be cached by the server, and the server returns a response back to the client. So what is a DNS cache poisoning attack? In a DNS cache poisoning attack, the attacker goal is to inject a malicious record into the resolver's cache. So if the client wants to resolve www.bank.com, instead of getting the legitimate IP address, it will get an IP address that the attacker controls. Okay, so in order to resolve a domain name, the client needs to prepare a query according to the DNS protocol, which runs over UDP. In the query, the client chooses a random source port and a random transaction ID. The transaction ID is used to match between queries and responses. Because DNS runs over UDP and not TCP, it needs a mechanism to link between different queries and the responses, and the mechanism is the transaction ID. The query is sent to the configured DNS server, which looks up a response in its database or does a recursive lookup and prepares a DNS response destined to a port that the query was previously sent from, and the same transaction ID, so that the resolver can link between the query and the response, and of course specifying the IP address of the domain. So what the attacker need to do in order to inject a malicious response. So for a response to be accepted, the source and destination IP need to match, the source and destination port need to match, the transaction ID need to match, and also the question need to match, namely www.bank.com. So out of these fields that the attacker need to match, it doesn't know the transaction ID because it does not observe the query. And further, it doesn't know the source port, again, because it does not observe the query. And because these are random, then the attacker have no choice but to guess the port and the transaction ID. Also, the attacker need to impersonate the DNS server, so to make its rogue response look like it comes from the authentic DNS server. And it needs to do all of this, that is to get the transaction ID and destination port right within the short period of time where the legitimate response is sent back to the client. This is because when the authentic response arrives at the client caches this response and will not issue another query for the same domain name for a TTL amount of time. So because the attacker needs to guess the destination port and the transaction ID right, and each of them is 16-bit, this gives each query a 32-bit of entropy, which is enough entropy to render this attack infeasible in the naive brute force case. However, as we know in the realm of internet protocols evolve, and DNS was not designed with security in mind. So in the past, only the transaction ID was used as a forgery defense. And as we said, the transaction ID is 16-bit, and this was demonstrated by Dan Kaminsky in 2008 to be too short, meaning that sending 64K packets is very much feasible. This is what Kaminsky showed. And the workaround to increase the each query's entropy is to randomize the UDP source port. So previously, the queries were sent from a known or very much predictable UDP source port. But if the UDP source port is truly random 16-bit, then this increases the entropy of each query together with the transaction ID to 32 bits. So despite of the UDP source port randomization, researchers found ways to defeat this defense. One recent attack is DNS, and it defeats source port randomization using ICMP sidechannel. So Linux uses a global ICMP rate limit counter, and researchers found a way to probe which UDP source ports are open at the machine, the resolver. And this allows attackers to predict or to know the source port for an outstanding query, and therefore attacker only needs to guess the transaction ID, which is 16-bit, and we said that is very much feasible. Another beautiful attack is against resolvers that defer the UDP ephemeral port selection to the operating system. And it turns out that Linux used prandom U32 function, which is a weak pseudo-random generator. So given enough outputs of prandom U32, it is possible to recover the state of the pseudo-random generator and predict the next ephemeral source port for UDP, thus defeating once again UDP source port randomization defense, and attacker only needs to guess the transaction ID. And this attack was successfully demonstrated against systemd resolve D stub resolver, which is commonly found in Linux distributions. So in another attempt to increase the entropy of queries was proposed a simple way called OX20 encoding, in which the stub resolver specified in the question section specified the domain name in a mixed case. So lowercase or uppercase randomly chosen. And the response is accepted if the case matches. And this is useful especially for long names. The problem with this defense, although it is effective and simple, is compatibility issues, because there are name servers in the internet that do not support OX20 encoding. So, for example, Google public DNS uses OX20 queries only for whitelisted name servers, and Cloudflare recently disabled it. But still, this is an effective defense or an effective way to increase the entropy.
So researchers found a way to bypass the OX20 encoding defense, as well as other randomization-based defenses. And the idea is as follows. When you think about a DNS response packet, then all the randomization-based defenses appear at the first part of the packet. So in the UDP header, we have the destination port. In the DNS header, we have the transaction ID. And in the question section that immediately followed by the DNS header, we have the domain name, which in case of the OX20 encoding is mixed case. So if the DNS response is fragmented, all of these randomization-based defenses appear in the first fragment, but not in the second fragment, where the answers to the query lies. So what the attacker could do to exploit this situation and take advantage of it, it can send ahead of time a spoofed second fragment to be cached by the recursive resolver, waiting for the first fragment to arrive. Then it issues a DNS query that will force a fragmented DNS response from the authoritative server. When the first fragment, the first legitimate fragment, arrive from the authoritative server, the recursive resolver would reassemble the two fragments into a single packet, because all fragments arrive from his perspective. And then the cache of the resolver will be poisoned because the second fragment contains malicious answers. There are two challenges with implementing this attack. The first challenge is forcing a fragmented DNS response. This is not as easy as it might seem. There are two ways two techniques to basically do this. One is to lower the path MTU between the authoritative server and the recursive resolver to a few dozen bytes, and then when the authoritative server sends a DNS response, it will be fragmented. The other way to accomplish this is works only on domains that are signed by DNSsec, and this is because DNSsec answers are typically long. The other challenge with implementing this attack is that the attacker needs to know the IP ID of the fragmented response ahead of time. So the IP ID of the authoritative server, of outgoing packets from authoritative server, need to be predictable. And this is not always the case. And basically, the IP ID should be randomized, not only to prevent this attack, but also to prevent device tracking, etc. So up until now in our talk, we talked about stub resolver, which reside in clients, so PCs, telephone, laptops. We talked about recursive resolvers that must return an answer for a query sent to them. We talked a bit about the authoritative servers that are in the control of the domain owners, and they give authoritative answers to the recursive resolver. And in this zoo of the DNS ecosystem, there's another animal called a DNS forwarder. And this box, the DNS forwarder, sits between the stub resolver and the recursive resolver, and it functions similar to a proxy. So it gets an answer, it gets a query from a stub resolver, and it sends this query to, if it knows the answer from the cache, then it serves this query immediately. But if it doesn't, then it queries an upstream recursive resolver that does a recursive lookup and gives it back the answer. And the DNS forwarder, once it gets an answer, it forwards the answer to the stub resolver that originally queried it. So what are the use cases for this box? So it is commonly found in home routers because it is a convenient default resolver in a local area network, because it is easily served by DHCP. Further, it allows for a load balancing between different upstream servers. Another advantage of using a forwarder is that it provides an extra layer of caching, and therefore it can reduce bandwidth and latency, because if this is a large network, if one machine resolves some domain, example.com, and another machine tries to resolve the same domain, the second query will be answered from the DNS forwarder cache, and the query wouldn't need to go to the recursive resolver and travel the internet. And also it is useful in scenarios where there's a need for some content filtering or a captive portal, for example. So the thing about DNS forwarders is that they evolve naturally out of necessity, and standards are lacking implementation guidelines for them. So, for example, it is unclear if the DNS forwarders should provide caching facilities, should they handle referrals like recursive resolver do, should they verify the response. This is unclear. There is one RFC that specifically talks about DNS proxy, which is a little bit different from DNS forwarders. And in this RFC, it says that proxy should be as transparent as possible, meaning that they should receive a query from a client and pass this query almost with no change to the upstream server and relay the response almost with no change. But as we know, DNS forwarders do more than that. So this is a hybrid creature in the DNS zoo, and it has a vague role. Therefore, it is an interesting object for study. And also, they are less studied compared to recursive resolver. So there's this Google study that looked at DNS mask and found some nice memory corruption bugs there. And there's another research that successfully demonstrated the defragmentation attack on DNS mask and other DNS forwarders. And there is some other research, but this is not that study. So in DNSpooq, we looked at DNS mask, and DNS mask is a popular DNS server and forwarder commonly found in home routers. In Linux, it comes with Linux distributions. It is even found in Android when you turn on the hotspot, in industrial control systems, IoT, etc. And we looked at DNS mask and found some 7 security vulnerabilities there. 3 bugs enable cache poisoning, and we will detail the cache poisoning bugs. And 4 bugs are memory corruption bugs that we will touch upon a little bit. Now we will begin describing the DNSpooq cache poisoning vulnerabilities against the DNS mask DNS forwarder. So the first thing to note about DNS mask is that as a DNS forwarder, it receives a queries from a client on the LAN, for example, and if it doesn't know the answer, then it forwards the queries to one of the configured upstream DNS server. So each such forwarded query or outstanding request is represented by an internal FREC structure, which stands for forward record structure in DNS mask, that contains the transaction ID of the original query and the forwarded query, and a hash of the question section. So DNS mask, instead of keeping or storing the whole question section, it stores a hash of it. So at any given time, DNS mask imposes a maximum of the number of forwarded queries. By default is 150. So in this example, where you see on the slide, the client query DNS mask for www.bank.com with a random source port and a random transaction ID. DNS mask doesn't know the answer, so it queries one of the upstream DNS servers, and it creates an FREC record containing the original transaction ID, the new ID of the new transaction ID of the forwarded query, and also notice that the new query has a random source port of its own. So when a response arrived, is it is accepted when it matches an FREC, an open FREC structure. Meaning it is accepted when the transaction ID match and the question section hash match. And internally, DNSmask uses 64 up to 64 sockets for to forwarding queries, and each of these UDP sockets is bound to a random source port. The issue within DNSmask, the security bug, is that responses may be accepted on any socket, regardless of the socket used to submit the query. So if the query was submitted from one socket, a valid response, a response that matches the transaction ID and the question section hash can be accepted on any of the 64 sockets. This is a problem because as an attacker, we only need to guess one of the 64 destination ports. So this reduces the entropy that the attacker needs to guess. Another issue that we found in DNSmask is regarding the question section hash. So DNSmask, when it is not compiled with DNSX port, uses the CRC32 algorithm as a hash function for the question section. The problem with that is that CRC32 is not a cryptographically secure hash function. And in fact, it is possible to find multiple values that hash to the same CRC32 value. And we done exactly that in our proof of concept. We generated 300,000 domain names that all hash to the same CRC32 value. So how can attacker exploit these two weaknesses into a practical DNS cache poisoning attack? So we will consider a scenario where the attacker controls one machine in the local area network. It can be a full control of this machine or a semi-control via malicious JavaScript, for example. And this attacker-controlled machine would generate queries that all have the same CRC32 value. So DNSmask will receive these queries and will forward each of them to its upstream DNS server, thus creating an FREC for each of them. And remember that the maximum FREC at any given time is 150. So the attacker arranges for 150 open FRECs at any given moment. In the meantime, the attacker generates responses, malicious responses, where in the response, the question section have the same CRC32 value as the queries, and will try to guess the destination port and transaction ID to one of the 64 ports open in DNSpass, and one of the 150 open FRECs in DNSpass. And because the forwarded query transaction ID and its source port are not linked, this is the first issue that we talked about. This reduces the entropy from 32 bits to about 19 bits, which is very much practical. And in fact, we successfully implemented the attack within a few seconds to few minutes. Another issue that we found in DNSmask is that there is no query deduplication mechanism implemented. So if a client asks for multiple queries for the same name, DNSmask will create an FREC for each of them and will forward the queries. And this behavior is useful when DNSsec is compiled, as we will talk about later, because it allows us to utilize other memory corruption vulnerabilities that we found. In terms of behavior that assist in implementing a successful cache poisoning attack, there is a behavior of DNS forwarders in general that have no response verification. So forwarders simply believe answers, any answer they got from the upstream recursive server, because they think that the recursive DNS server validated the response. And another behavior of DNSmask is that its caching mechanism is record-based instead of answer-based. So instead of keeping a whole answer for a question, it keeps each individual record it got in the answer in the cache. And this assists attacker in poisoning the cache, for example, using a CNAME chain, where the attacker aliases its site with the domain it wants to poison, namely in this example www.bank.com, and then includes a record that links www.bank.com to one of the IP addresses that the attacker chose. All right, so now we'll take a broader look and assume attacker has a DNS cache poisoning capability. What can he do with it? So the first and most straightforward thing is that DNS cache poisoning provides man-in-the-middle capabilities for the attacker. So the attacker poisons a target domain name and redirects the client to the attacker IP address, where he can see the traffic and interfere with the traffic and do all sorts of bad stuff. The second straightforward thing is that it is possible to deny service from user by redirecting the user to some bogus IP address that doesn't contain the service. And the third thing that we will touch upon is that a DNS cache poisoning essentially relies on response forgery, which increases the attack surface on the device running a vulnerable DNS software. So basically, any protocol that is not encrypted is somehow susceptible to man-in-the-middle. And one of the main protocols that is not encrypted and was widely used is HTTP. And if the attacker hijacks HTTP session, it can inject malicious JavaScript, it can change website appearance to assist in phishing campaigns, etc. One interesting place that we found that still uses HTTP is package managers. For example, Ubuntu still uses HTTP to access its repositories and download packages. So the attacker can affect those two. Of course, the packages are signed, so we are not sure how much it gives the attacker, but it's certainly still a valid concern. In terms of relevance, we think that it is not that relevant in our current situation on the internet. So per Google Transparency Report, 95% of the internet traffic is encrypted. And by using TLS, the link between the client and server is protected against man-in-the-middle attacks. Another protocol that is widely used in the internet is the SMTP protocol that is used to send emails. And SMTP protocol relies on DNS MX records to find the target mail server. And so if the attacker has a capability to spoof an MX record, he can hijack emails, basically. Of course, if the SMTP session is not encrypted. Also, another defense mechanism that we have in the email ecosystem is SPF, Sender Policy Framework, that is used for the receiving mail server to authenticate which mail server can send it emails from the organization. And SPF relies on DNS text records to do that. So if the attacker has a capability to spoof, to insert arbitrary records in a resolver cache, it can bypass this defense mechanism. Another defense mechanism is MTA STS, Mail Transfer Agent Strict Transport Security, and it also relies on DNS to deliver the policy. So it can be suppressed too if the attacker has capabilities to mount a cache poisoning attack. Another interesting target for a cache poisoning attack is NTP, the Network Time Protocol, that is used to sync computer clocks. So NTP is an unencrypted protocol, and it has no man-in-the-middle defense mechanism. So if the attacker places himself as the NTP server, he can move client back in time or to future time. So what does this by an attacker? So an attacker could trick client, could roll client back in time and trick them into accepting an already expired TLS certificate, for example. It can also cause cache flashing attack if it moves the victim into the future. So typically, software caches entries for a specific amount of time, and if the attacker moves the client into the future, then the cache would be flashed. Also, an interesting target for time-shifting attacks is authentication protocols that typically contain a timestamp within them to prevent replay attacks. So if the attacker can roll back the victim a few minutes, then it can replay a ticket that was already expired, for example. Another interesting target for an attacker is attacking certificate authorities that use domain validation. So domain validation relies on the DNS protocol to verify domain ownership. So the requester of the certificate requests a certificate for some domain, and the certificate authority uses DNS to query the server for some cookie, for example, and that way it knows that the requester really owns the domain it wants the certificate for. So by poisoning the DNS that the certificate authority uses, it is possible to issue fraudulent certificates. This is probably relevant for DNSpooq because probably certificate authorities do not use DNS mask as their DNS server. However, it's still an issue for cache poisoning attacks in general. Another impact that is relatively straightforward, but if we look at it from another angle, then I think it is interesting. We said that it is possible using a DNS cache poisoning attack to deny service from user. So it is possible for an attacker to deny service from a victim site for multiple users and then demand money in order to unpoison the cache or recover user access for the victim site. We think this is a threat in a world where ransomware attacks happen in a regular basis. Another interesting impact of cache poisoning attack is increased attack surface on the device running the vulnerable DNS software. So DNS is a complex protocol, and many of the complexities within DNS software is exposed when a response is accepted. So many new code paths. And attacker needs the response forgery that the cache poisoning attacks basically gives in order to execute this code. And we think that a beautiful illustration of this is the memory corruption bugs we found in the DNSsec implementation of DNS mask. In order to reach this code flow for an off-path attacker, it first needs to get his response accepted. And once it gets its response accepted, it can use the memory corruption bugs to possibly take over the device. So this is another issue that we think is very relevant to these types of attacks. So to conclude, does DNS spoofing matter in the modern area? So we think that it is still important, but less than before, because the internet progresses and there are more encryption in protocols. It's still important because there is application-specific protocols that might be not encrypted, and B, for the reasons we talked about, for example, emails and NTP, and also we think that there is some unexplored potential for attackers here beyond what we said in this talk. So what can we do as an industry and as individuals to protect ourselves against these types of attacks. So I think it is very effective to use transport security for DNS. So, for example, DNS over HTTPS or DNS over TLS. This is to secure the link between the forwarder and the upstream server. So this prevents DNSpooq from running. Also, we need to continue with the DNSsec deployment. So DNSsec is used to authenticate DNS records, and right now it is not very widely deployed, and it could be effective in preventing such attacks. And of course, we should regularly patch software, and as a community, a security community, continue the research in DNS security, because it is critical for the internet. And with that, we'll finish our talk. Thank you for listening, and feel free to ask any questions. Enjoy your conference.
Okay, thank you, Moshe. So we're gonna have maybe a couple of questions for you.
Any questions in the audience?
Any question on the IRC? At least I've got one question. So you stated that one of your recommendation is, of course, to patch regularly the equipment, but you're talking about millions of networking equipment, specifically home routers. Did you make any research on Shodan, for example, to see if there were many devices that were affected by the vulnerability that you've been disclosing? And do you really think that patch management will solve this problem?
So that's a great question. So we did a little bit of Shodan research and found that there are approximately 1 million, give or take, devices that DNS mask devices that are open to the internet. And so clearly patching is important, but there are other workarounds to the specific DNSpooq vulnerabilities. One thing you could do is disable the caching. If there is no caching, then there is nothing to poison. Another thing that I think it's worth doing is implementing DNS over HTTPS, some DNS transport security mechanism. Does that answer your question?
Yes, part of it, but it was a very wide question, and I'm sorry. We got another question.
Yeah, in your last slide, you talk about mitigation using DNSsec. Do you think cryptography can solve all the issue, and how long does it take to deploy the cryptography new DNS in the world?
So DNSsec is a bit complex DNS protection mechanism, and it used to authenticate DNS records. So the facts are that it is not that deployed, widely deployed, because it is complex and there is all this key management that the domain owners need to do. But still, I think it can solve part of the problem. So I think it is worth investing in it as an industry.
Okay, thank you. We got a question on the IRC. Couldn't we generate a Let's Encrypt certificate by poisoning the TXT records?
So that depends if Let's Encrypt use DNS mask as their DNS server, but more generally, it is possible. I think certificate authorities use, they have some ways to mitigate such attacks by querying different DNS servers. So it is not that trivial as it sounds, because attacker may need to poison many name servers to accomplish this, but in theory it is possible. And I have a link to a paper that speak about it in the slides.
Okay, thank you, Moshe, for that interesting work and basically the heritage of Ripple 20. And keep the good work. And we're looking forward to hear and read for you later on.